we can look at the effects of climate change with an industry perspective, you know, all the way from up north to down south, different species, all the way from marine water to fresh water. And when I show this slide, I ask people which picture they're looking at. And invariably someone says tuna or whatever. But the point I make is that the most important pictures are the ones with people in them. And that's what this project is about. Because we have a lot of different partners in different areas of Europe, we're able to look at different types of aquaculture, from salmon and mussels. So the major players: trout, oysters, clams, shellfish, some up-and-coming species like meager. And they're different colored lines, and I'll tell you what those mean in a second. And then in terms of marine fisheries, the same kind of thing. We have the major stocks of pelagics and demersals. Again, having different locations allow us to make some interesting comparisons too, hopefully across different regions of Europe. And some of you are from these institutions. The most important point of this consortium is that it was built with industry in mind, and so we have these areas where we have an industry and an academic or a national lab working together. And in terms of fisheries, we have two in the Netherlands. We have Visnet, which is a flatfish, and we have PFA, pelagic freeze trawlers. And this has been a big benefit right from the beginning to build industry in, because the kinds of issues that a shellfish farmer is going to have in the Argave with climate change, and I'll go over that in a little bit, are completely different than what one of the largest trout producers in Europe is going to have, Killich, where things are getting warmer. It's a different type of culture system. Also, for aquaculture, there's a lot of indirect effects of climate. So people are concerned about jellyfish coming through nets, and so we have a veterinarian on board. They talk about do they need to install bubble nets to keep the jellyfish from impinging on the cages? How can we predict these indirect effects like disease, jellyfish, and harmful algal blooms? And when you talk about climate change, you have to get your message right, and it's not necessarily that it's going to get warmer. You have to talk about what the fishermen care about. In terms of the flat fishermen, they don't really care about climate change. They care about spatial squeeze, because the North Sea is filling up, and then you can change that conversation and say, well, in the future that's much warmer. If we don't care about the environment, there may be less wind farms. So if there's less wind farms, then there's going to be more fishing opportunities. So it's a way to bring them into the conversation. So yeah, actually, it does have something to do with climate and what we do in the future with renewable energy. And so we have 25 storylines. We have a website, and you can check out and see what we're doing on each of these. But I'll just kind of run you through the way the project's structured. It's without a pointer, it's really difficult for me to do this. So work package 1 at the top is the physics and the biogeochemistry and understanding scenarios of climate. And then basically you got species environment, you got economic analyses, and you have some social science as well put in, and the communication plays a large part in this. And I'll take you through very briefly some of the things we've accomplished. When you try to model climate in regional seas, you have to have very specific tools, because what works in the Baltic Sea is very specific, and what works up in the Barents and Norwegian Sea versus the Northeast Atlantic and the Med. And we have 4 different models, and they've been downscaled, meaning that they're able to provide information at a resolution that's meaningful for fisheries, and it's difficult to do for aquaculture, right? Because they really want very detailed information about locations, which is difficult for us to do. And in this program, we're looking at a business as usual, 8.5, which is going to lead to more warming, more radiation, and 4.5, which is the blue one. I'm sorry, it's the blue one on this. And so there's only 2 scenarios that we're looking at, and I'll just show you some estimates for the North Sea and the Mediterranean using the same model. What you're shown here is how much it's going to warm in the future based upon 4.5, which is moderate warming, and 8.5. And the scale shows the magnitude of change in temperature in about 50 years. So, you can look at the colors for the North Sea and the Med for 4.5 or 8.5, and so you're around 2 or 3 degrees under 8.5. And one of the interesting things that we saw from this model was when we start to look at how much phytoplankton productivity there'll be. So at the base of the food web, and if you look, for example, in the Mediterranean, you see a gradient in what's predicted in the future, where in some cases there'll be a more productivity at the base of the food web versus in the eastern Med, where it's actually expected to go down. And there's also a north-south gradient. The North Sea is totally blue in this model, so it projects that the North Sea will be less productive in terms of its phytoplankton and lower trophic levels. So we have these available for, they're on a server, they're downscaled, and this group could use these estimates to link in with some of the growth stuff they want to do. The other thing we did is a gap analysis and meta-analysis. Basically, we reviewed the literature and decided, well, how much do we know about how climate is going to directly affect marine fisheries, marine aquaculture, and call it inland waters. And so you can see the species that we've focused on, and they're the most valuable species. I think we had 34 species. And I'll just go through what we discovered by very carefully going through the literature. And that's not just going to a library like this and looking through the stacks. There's a whole process of having 6 different people reviewing the literature, each of them looking at one species to see how well they do, calculate their agreement, and if it's not acceptable, do it again. And so once you're done with this process, we're looking at the same kinds of studies, we're doing an appropriate search. Once that's acceptable, then we move forward and we did a Web of Science search, and we got 21,700 hits, which was a lot. And then you have some filtering that you put it through, and basically for the gap analysis, the inclusion that the criteria we had, we're down to about 350. And then for the meta-analysis, it's even a little more exclusive, so you're down to about 125 studies. So, so this summarizes the amount of data sets that are available that are looking at various things that we've been talking about: growth physiology, growth and mortality, temperature tolerance, distribution migration, etc. here. And then this is the effective temperature, pH, salinity, oxygen, and then the interaction. And the colors are the sectors. So you can kind of squint your eyes, and if you're a fisherman, maybe you'll look at the blue colors. But the thing to really look at is down here, that we really love studying temperature, but we don't really like or do a good job studying the kind of interactions we've been talking about, which is temperature and oxygen, right? Very few data sets. And it's not like Europeans don't do any work or research, right? There's a long history of research in Europe doing these kinds of studies, but in terms of direct effects, you can already see that there's some gaps in knowledge. If you look at this data set, you can cut it different ways. If you just want to look at the species where most data are collected, you got carp at the top, trout. You've got herring. Herring is the one marine fish that we've done a lot of work on. Cod is up here, close to the middle. So you're getting an idea that there are only some species that we've worked a lot on, and many species we haven't worked that much on. Now, if you take it one step further and say, well, here are the species, what about what life stage they are? So then you can see that, for example, embryos have been studied a lot for marine fisheries. And these other stages haven't. And that's just the opposite if you look at freshwater species, where we're looking at a lot of it at adults and juveniles. Alan, I have to think, or who was it that had the same little shadow images? So you kind of know what we're looking at. But so let's cut it a little further, just so you get an idea of what this gap analysis found. So what about these different interactions? So temperature comes out. We study a lot on temperature. We don't look at interactions much. And this is by life stage now, shown here in the colors. So basically, it's what I already showed you, that we're really not studying things in the lab in terms of interactions. And when we do, we might be looking at only embryos or certain life stages. And finally, then you can cut it again and look at what response we've been looking at. And in most cases, it's growth and development versus temperature. And yeah, not much else. Some things on physiology, but just to give you an impression of the way this data set works. And the last point I'll make about this is that if we hope to compare how a species will respond in Norway versus in the North Sea, so let's say cod, we would like to have studies conducted in both those areas. And that's, what you're seeing here are these different areas: Western Med, Bay of Biscay, Atlantic, up to the Barents up north. And we don't have the ability with the data set that we've looked at to make these types of comparisons in a way that we would like to. The meta-analysis, we had to make some decisions about. So a meta-analysis basically tries to take the results of studies and compile them together to say whether or not there was always an effect of a treatment or sometimes not. So when these error bars cross this line, which is 0, that means essentially there's no consistent, significant effect. Okay? And so you could look at things like growth, and you have 11 studies that study growth. They might be on different species, so mollusks or demersal species or pelagic species. And so this is generally what we found for growth, for just the effect of temperature. And remember, there's a lot of studies that have looked at this. Acidification, we begin to see negative effects coming out particularly for the mollusks. And then deoxygenation, although there are very few studies, we definitely see effects on growth where we have the studies to make that comparison. So just for the freshwater finfish. So, and again, these are specific. We had to define what we considered warming, which was difficult, what we considered ocean acidification, and what we considered hypoxia or deoxygenation. So, and of course, I was a bit frustrated that we didn't have more studies to do this, but the more people I talked to who had done meta-analysis said, yeah, that's pretty much what you have. You don't have a lot of studies that you can make these comparisons with. And the top line is what I just showed you in terms of growth, but you can also look at mortality. We have no data for deoxygenation, or you can look at metabolism. And so, obviously, temperature should have an effect on metabolism, and that's what we're seeing. Deoxygenation should also have an effect, and we see that in some cases. So that's the result of the meta-analysis, which is in review right now in Fish and Fisheries. Now, in terms of, the other thing I want to talk about is something I know very little about, which is always a good idea in a talk like this. And that's to go through the fact that we're doing these statistical analyses of time series to try to understand how things have changed. And we're not doing it for every species everywhere. There's a lot of this work already available. And so there's been a variety of different types of things that have been done. For example, they'll have all kinds of different variables that they compare in a time series. And then they'll line them up in terms of the variables that have changed from low to high or negative to positive to see how the whole system has changed. And in this case, the end result of this kind of study for the Barents Sea basically suggests that cod is not only responding to temperature, but it's also probably responding to fishing and other things in terms of its changes that have occurred in that ecosystem. Another result, which is dealing with the ecosystem, is how many species do you actually have in a place like the North Sea? So they've looked at the ICES rectangles. They have temperature trends calculated in Q1 and Q3, so we know it's warming. And then what's happening with the species richness, so how many species do we actually see in these areas? And you can see that the southern North Sea is very different than the northern North Sea, which is something we already knew. If you look at the number of southern or warm water species coming in, you can see that there's a lot of warm water species coming in over the time period that they looked at it in this study. So, but then getting into individual species, the University of Hull has looked at these small fish that use estuaries on either side of the British Isles and whether they've shifted in the way they're using these estuaries. And it's a bit funky when you look, on the west or the east for different species. The patterns, they suggest some of them are definitely related to warming. If it was related to warming, this would be like latitude changes, so you'd expect things going up. You see a lot of different patterns in these data. But we have these data analyzed.
Can I just stop you for 1 minute?
Yeah.
Do people want to go on the campus tour? No, nobody?
Go where?
So, the campus tour, which was supposed to start in 5 minutes, but and then it was a public event at 4. So we already know campus tour? Yeah. I guess.
All right, I'll speed up.
Okay.
How long have I been talking? Like 15 minutes?
An hour and 50.
It feels like an hour. I know. Thanks guys. Thanks a lot. John Pinniger showed these data a couple days ago, where the CFAS has a rich data set from 1902 to 2016 in the lengths of place and how they changed over time. The analyses of those data suggests that once you get above 10.5 degrees, the sizes decline. We had some eutrophication issues in the North Sea, which then went down. And so more phosphates were faster growth, so maybe cleaning up the North Sea wasn't such a great idea in terms of growth of fish. Medium fishing pressure led to the greatest sizes, and there's strong year classes. You see some fish competing for resources, and they're smaller. Then looking, using a different type of model, we have a model that's able to project the distribution of fish from 2008 to 2017 for small fish. So the black dots are where we see the fish, and the colors are where the model predicts. And then the model is able to project for these large fish. You see they're leaving the coastal areas, it's getting too warm from them, and they're moving offshore. And this is a model that includes migration and some other factors in it. Anchovy, we've looked at two different stocks of anchovy and sardine. One is in the Bay of Biscay. The Bay of Biscay collapsed 2002 to 2015. The fish were, what they could catch was distributed down here. They closed the fishery for 4 years, started coming back, and then there's a recovery period where things are beginning to spread out a little bit. And they've looked at the reasons behind that in terms of not only the fishing pressure, but when they released from fishing, what's going on with the environment, how the environment might affect the productivity of anchovy. Down in the Mediterranean, the anchovy and sardine are very small now. Their condition factor is low, and the fish size is much reduced. And they've related this in the Northwest Med to warming in the case of anchovy. So things are getting smaller with increased temperature. And then, a climate index, this Western Mediterranean Oscillation Index, an atmospheric pressure index, and salinity. And so, we're trying to tease out the environmental factors that affect fish size so that we can put it into models to make projections. I'll skip this. Tuna, there's a fairly long data set for tuna, and if you analyze it using the stars and other techniques, you can begin to look at different regions of the data that are partitioned, likely because recruitment has been in different levels, and that recruitment is related to changes in the temperature regime. So again, if we understand how temperature can affect recruitment of bluefin, then they're going to put that into a bioeconomic model. The last example is, I hope, is a winner, right? So there's not just losers, but there's also winners with climate. And this is dolphin fish. So as it gets warmer in the Mediterranean, dolphin fish is growing faster. The season is going to open a little earlier, and the fishermen are going to have to be able to reap those benefits and prepare for that. So that's some of the projections that we're making. It's difficult to tease out, but they don't have a really good data set. They just have landings, and so they have to understand catch per unit effort. So it's a data set that isn't really fit for analyzing things quantitatively with the environment, but they're trying to work that out for dolphin fish. And then I really won't talk about the economic analyses, but certainly we have projection models, and we're making projections, not just looking at the past, but looking at the future. John Pinniger, in all hopes, will have an updated version of this soon, where he and colleagues have used a variety of different models to provide some kind of indication of how far north in the North Sea things might shift in the future. So you can find your favorite species if you speak Latin. And these are pelagic fish, so mackerel. Mackerel's there. Thank you. Yeah, it's hard. I actually can't see anything. So, so you can see that pelagics are predicted to go much further than the demersals. But the point I want to make about this graph is that this is the ensemble approach, where you have different types of models that are predicting where fish should be now and in the future, and you run those and you get an idea of, well, actually, we're not really sure, but we have a tendency to believe that, from those models, they're going to be here. And that's good information. It's not just one number. And then, of course, we have models to look at the bioeconomic ramifications of changes in distribution, right? And so those are all developed in specific areas for specific species, and those are not, they're being run right now, and I won't go into them. The last thing I want to talk about very briefly is particularly since we have a stakeholder in the room, and I'm very nervous about this now. We used to consider, we have a lot of research advisors that we bring in, very smart people like Greta and William. Actually, they're all smart. And we pay a lot of money for them to come to our meetings, and they give us really hard criticism. And I think our program has really benefited from that. But we also have this reference user group, which is someone who runs a salmon business in Norway, a mussel farmer, some people in policy. And so we benefit from those people who were built in the beginning, but really we've benefited from the fact that this program, the people in each region have reached out to their stakeholders and had whatever kind of meeting works, whether it's a small meeting or a larger meeting. They've done all kinds of things, interviews, questionnaires, focus groups. Conference presentations is in a smaller font because I think that's just not the way that we're going to communicate effectively with stakeholders. It's something that we do as scientists, but doesn't really help the goals of this part of this project. And one thing we've learned, just to give you a quick example from talking to these mussel farmers in the Argov, is that, you know, they're worried about mussel biomass they can sell. And then they say, well, that's really due to the upwelled waters that bring nutrients and allow the mussels to grow. Upwelled waters are colder, actually. And so what they're worried about is what's going to happen in the future with the wind, right? So how much wind's going to bring that upwelling? And if there's a lot of upwelling, temperature's low, and the mussels grow slower. So that's important to them. And also, they're worried about storms, and so they're going to have to invest in technology. Unlike your boat, their offshore cages or lines can't withstand large storms. And then, of course, they want to do the economics. You got to have a certain marketable biomass. You know, what's the profitability of the business. But the other thing that comes into this, which we didn't expect, was the fact that if you have certain types of upwelling, you get harmful algal blooms. And they'll have a lot of mussel biomass they can't sell because the mussels can't go onto the market. And so this has been a very useful technique of mind mapping. It's a Bayesian belief network. We've used a second type of mind mapping, which is horrible to show to stakeholders. Exactly, there you go. And then it's called a bow tie. But the bow tie is really cool. Like, if we were in this room looking at this, you know, this is for mackerel, right? So there's all kinds of information here about what causes problems, you know, how you can control those potential problems, you know, what are the consequences if you can't mitigate the problems, right? And you can read the text, but we want to get this level of information, but and we've been doing that using questionnaires that hide the bow tie, right? They hide the bow tie. But we also have to figure out how to then talk to folks about what we do find. So for the dolphin fish, developing infographics that are relatively simple to understand, to say, yeah, there's going to be a shift in when you can do some fishing. You know, why is it important for the dolphin fishermen, pardon me. So the infographics is really important, and we need to work on how we communicate that to the industry. So no bow ties. We're all tired of seeing bow ties, even the scientists. So that was my quick presentation of CERES. You can read the stuff on the screen here. We have data available. We can help out, and we want to reach out to fishermen and farmers. We've been doing this, and it's been effective. I'm sorry we're not up in Scotland. You know, we could have had a beer together and talked about some stuff, but we had lunch, so that was nice. So thanks. That's it. If you have questions, I think the Clownfish people have seen this talk 3 times now because we go to each other's annual meetings. But it's an overview. So you guys from the U.S. get a sense of how these things are structured. There's 26 partners. You know, it's kind of it's chaos, but managed chaos, and it's working. Yeah, Melissa.
Just curious, how long has this project been up and running?
This project's been running since March 2016, and so we had a recent meeting in Hamburg where we're already planning for that kind of final year, more or less. So March this year has been our final year. And there's no follow-up. That the EU doesn't have, well, we're going to fund 4 years and then we're going to extend you. They don't do that. Yeah.
Should I ask?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. That was a great presentation. I really like the way the meta-analysis information was presented. I think this is exactly the thing that needs to happen from our perspective in terms of, this body in trying to organize and characterize our attributes and data on growth throughout the globe.
John? It's gotta be screwed.
It is.
We're here, just take.
Anyway, no problem. And I think that sort of a lot of this information can help structure, sort of give us sideboards or the types of responses that we might be able to form some initial hypotheses on. And one of the tasks that we may, and maybe you guys have already done this, but other areas of the world we may need to conduct this type of analysis. And it would be useful to see kind of the steps or the decision rules and code that maybe you use to generate it.
Yeah. You'll probably have 5 questions, so I'll just keep the mic there. But so NOAA obviously has done a ton of work on ocean acidification and temperature and other things. So I was at the EPA lab when they were doing all the water quality criteria for oxygen. So I mean, there's a lot of data out there. We did survey the data for the key species in Europe that existed elsewhere. So we didn't just look within Europe. But yeah, there's as an editor too of a journal, I see them coming in. I mean, now there's diel differences in treatments and there's seasonal differences, and it's much more realistic. So I think we're getting there relatively quickly, but there's still some gaps.
And just to follow up on that, I think it would be important to differentiate in the presentation of these different studies and attributes or climate effects, which ones are laboratory-based versus observational from field data.
These were all lab studies.
Oh, okay, I didn't.
So that's the thing. So
Okay.
if you were to do a search, these were all, the gap analysis was, the meta-analysis is all lab studies.
Okay.
The gap analysis was also all studies on direct effects. So they were all lab studies as well. But many of those lab studies weren't truly replicated.
Oh, okay.
They just, you couldn't do a meta-analysis on them.
So you would, if you were looking at the literature that contains sort of observational data on the relationship or the effect of temperature or ocean acidification or whatever on growth or distribution, you would have more data to work with, from my understanding then.
Yeah, you would. They would have killed me in this project because I mean this is one task of many, and that's the thing when you cut the cake for 5 million, or close to 6 million. How do you try to accomplish everything? Because you want to do the bioeconomic modeling. You want to engage with the stakeholders. You want to have time to make this. So this was an interesting academic. Not only academic. I mean, it's very important, but it was only a small part of the project. Yeah.
From the equator to the Arctic.
Yeah.
And the Atlantic.
Yeah, in inland waters too. Yeah. So
Amazing. Good job.
wasn't me.
Somebody had a day job.
I hired someone. Yeah. Do you have any questions about what I showed? You don't have to say anything. You had enough of me at lunch.
There were some questions as we went along, but I've forgotten what they were.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the stakeholder interaction, on the stakeholder interaction process, I think it's something that we're working a lot with too. And I guess this question to you too, George. I feel like we ought to be pushing more in this context to try to have these longer term repeated interactions, so that we don't sort of say here's a flyer, here's understand everything, but more let's say we're going to engage with people on a 2-year half dozen interaction kind of level, where you can kind of make some things understood, have some questions. And did you experiment with, or what was I saw you had these this group of people involved, and you're thinking about, are there better ways that we can kind of longer term engage with people?
The way I put it to the partners, who by the way had no money to do the stakeholder engagement, which was not a good plan as a coordinator, was that they're building a relationship, as Greta said, they're building a relationship with their local folks, and it's not the only EU project that's going to come around, and so it's that relationship that you focus on. It's not necessarily CERES, you know, and the kinds of questions we ask in this project, but it opens up for future projects. And I mean, some of these folks have very good relationships with the industry, right? I mean, they're very close to them. So we took advantage of that here. We built some new bridges too. But the EU projects, they run for 4 years, and that's it. So it's more the national level, I think, where you see these longer-term relationships, and that's where you should think about programs that are funded more long-term. The EU could do something like that, and that was a recommendation we made when we went to Brussels about a year ago, 6 months ago, was to have that kind of research happen, and when they plan that kind of research, maybe that could be longer-term than 4 years. I mean, this is community-level research. Economics, studies on you know, family motivations, you know, things like that. So those data are hard to come by, and particularly if you want to make comparisons across Europe, we can't do that in this program because we don't have those data. We don't have the time to do it. Yeah.
Did this group, and you might have mentioned this and maybe I spaced it out, but did this group come to some decision and prioritization on future action items like research activities that need to be conducted to better understand these effects and filling gaps?
Yeah, that'll be part of our synthesis. That'll be part of Climfish's synthesis, I guess, too. That's kind of like that's the thing you always do in EU projects, is you talk about how much money you need to do more research. I think, yeah, you know, I mean, so yes, right? And so we learned very quickly that the kind of physical modeling we're doing is more or less, it's not inappropriate, but it's kind of it's as basic as you can get, you know, so you need more money to develop. So one example, you need a program that would develop to do kind of the ensemble modeling that Paul and people in Climb have done. We don't have that in Europe, right? So the other thing is that, you know, this kind of climate change scenarios for point sources, you know, like aquaculture farms. You know, like you need the physics done. So that would be one example of, you know, we can right away say, you know, we had to compromise, and so every compromise we made in this program, we could turn into a research project. Yeah.
And let me follow up, and what I'm trying to get to is sort of what the group or what decisions or ideas the group had as a whole that might recommend the distribution of funding to laboratory-based fields, laboratory versus field studies, or both.
Well, so this program is designed to provide policy recommendations, so top-down, means, and so is Climfish, and also bottom-up through industry. So that's our goal, right? So that's the carrot, that's what we really want. And in terms of the research that we need to get done, yeah, I mean, when I gave my talk in Brussels, I said, I gave the gap analysis results, and I said, you know, this is what we know right now, and we should fund more of this work. But part of me feels like that isn't really the focus of CERES, because I think for me as a coordinator, seeing the relationships you build with the stakeholders and the fact that you can make recommendations to industry that they implement, or at least that they hope to implement, or that's useful, I think that's like the big win, just in my perspective. John, maybe you feel differently, but yeah.
The other thing is it's a very diverse group of 200 scientists. I mean, it does range from people who are lab specialists through people working in fisheries institutes like myself, all the way through to, well, there's some policy people there too, and economists, social scientists. They all want more research in their own area. And they all want it in their own geographical area as well. And so it's a comparatively small amount of money for the ambition that this project has had. It's hugely ambitious.